No one knows how to use this room ever. But I want to thank you guys all for coming. I'm really glad that everybody got to brave the snow and came in for some pizza to join us for this event. I assume you guys are all here because you know that the interaction between LGBT rights and HIV activism in Africa is an important deal right now. Either you're here because you know that HIV affects African security, if you're a security student, or you're a global health student, so you know that HIV affects everything. Maybe you're a human rights student and you think that LGBT rights are human rights. Or you just go to any event that has rainbows and free pizza like me. So I also wanted to thank some of our sponsors. We have Queer Bell, Queer Straight Alliance. We also have the Center on Rights Development, who's focusing on the right to health this year. Students for Africa, who's amazing and loves everything African. And Global Health Affairs Program, which I assume most of you are in right now. So my name is Alex Sheldon. I am a second-year human rights student, and I'm also in Global Health Affairs program. I spent the summer in Kenya with Dr. Botta, and that's actually how part of the idea for this, this panel came about. We also wanted to thank, we're going to show a video of an interview we had with a Kenyan activist this summer, so I wanted to thank Lindsay Lack, who's here with us today, who did all the editing for this in a few short days, which is amazing, and also Shayla Rivera, part of our Kenya team, who helped out. We wouldn't be here without you guys, so thank you very much. So the idea for this event came from a very unfortunate event that happened over the summer. In July 2013, Eric Lubembe was found murdered and tortured in his house. He was a very prominent gay advocate and an activist for HIV access to health and care in Cameroon. And this came just like a week after he had just sent out a huge warning to all of his activist friends that there were anti-gay thugs that were on the prowl to hurt them and to attack them. So this has been called an assault on a movement because he was an advocate, he was an author, and he was very much the face of the movement in Cameroon. So his murder was taken as an assault. It was an attempt to intimidate and to silence all of his fellow activists. So this was felt worldwide. The international media took onto this, and it also struck a chord here at DU. So we were approached to start this conversation about why this happened, what are the interactions between LGBT activism and HIV activism, what are the ways forward. And so Renee and I sat down and we decided that since we were working with LGBT activists in Kenya, that we would try to take that as a starting point for this conversation. So today we're going to be talking about these interconnections, and I'll introduce the panelists in a minute. We're going to talk about these interconnections. So we're not here today to tell you exactly why he died, and we're probably not going to ever predict that this is going to happen again. But what our panel is going to offer today is like a wide range of experiences and expertise. And each of these panelists has worked in HIV advocacy for a number of years, some of which in Africa, some of which other places in the world, some of which here. And so we're going to draw from these perspectives, and we're going to try to entangle some of the interconnections between LGBT rights, human rights, HIV, health, violence, discrimination, and the future of Africa's development. So joining us today we have, I want to get all of these credentials right, so I'm going to read some of the things. We have Dr. Ben Young, who some of you know as the teacher of one of our favorite courses here. If you guys haven't taken it yet, you should. Dr. Ben Young is the Vice President and Chief Medical Officer of the International Association of Providers of AIDS Care, a Washington, D.C.-based international non-governmental organization. He cares for people living with HIV at Apex Family Medicine in Denver, Colorado. He's also the adjunct professor for the HIV and AIDS International Affairs class, which really I recommend you all take, and the assistant clinical professor of medicine at the University of Colorado. Dr. Young is an HIV clinician researcher and is a principal investigator with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's HIV Outpatient Study, or HOPS. His research interests include improving engagement in medical care, antiretroviral therapies, and aging with HIV. The author of 80 peer-reviewed research publications, his research has been presented at international meetings, including the International AIDS Conference and the Conference on Retroviruses and Opportunistic Infections. So he's also a member of the International AIDS Society, HIV Medicine Association, the American Academy of HIV Medicine, and contributing author to thebody.com and medscape.com. So I had to read all of So, Dr. Messer is also joining us today. He served for 29 years as the University and Seminary President, first in South Dakota and then at the Iowa School of Theology right here in Denver. He's the author of 15 books relating the church's mission and the ministry to social issues like homosexuality, reproductive health, assisted death, HIV, and AIDS. Currently, he serves as the executive director of a charity he founded called the Center for the Church and Global AIDS, which raises funds and supports persons infected and affected with HIV around the world. Dr. Messer has also worked extensively in East Africa, and that's how I came to know him. He was the first line of contact for us in reaching out to LGBT activists on the ground in Kenya. Through him, we met an amazing reverend named Dr. John Makoa, who's Peter's going to be talking about later in his interview, who is he's a straight ally advocate in Kenya for the promotion of LGBT rights, where their identities are criminalized. He's a pretty unbelievable man. So thank you so much for joining us as well. And then finally, we have Renee Botta. Renee is Associate Professor of International Health. She's the Professor of International Health and Development Communication and the Chair of the Department of Media, Film, and Journalism Studies at the University of Denver. She spent more than a decade working in Africa to improve health outcomes through participatory communication. She studied communication about AIDS and HIV as a Fulbright scholar in Zambia back in 2003. Since that time, she has continued to study health communication and behavior change in a number of countries, including Zambia, Kenya, South Africa, and the United States and Ghana. Her most recent work is focused on water, sanitation, and hygiene in Kenya, a project that Shayla and I were happy to join her on this past summer. So that is about the order that we're going to go in for the panelists speaking today. Each one of them is going to talk for about 15 minutes. Some of them have slides, some don't. Some of them have great anecdotes. I think all of them must. And after that, we're going to listen to a short interview, about 15 minutes I think it got down to. This was an original interview that lasted about an hour or so, and we managed to cut it down to 15 minutes of really key, crucial points. And then after that, I'm going to wrap it up with a little bit of a picture of the international community's role in the promotion of LGBT rights globally. So thank you all again for joining us. I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Young so we can get started.
Well, thanks, Alex. And thanks everybody for coming. I hope it's more than just pizza, but that's all it takes for me to come out and attend a conference. So this is a really important subject, and Alex asked me to give, I guess, one clinician's view of HIV/AIDS, both globally and domestically, and at least allude to some of what at least are obvious interconnections between HIV as a health issue and LGBT rights and health access and so on. And I'll try to sprinkle in a little bit of anecdotes when appropriate. I have to use PowerPoint slides because I'm forgetful and I get lost. So the first thing I wanted to cover in light speed here, again, for those of you, some of you are old friends, and those of you who will be new friends can come and listen to me next quarter, and we can go through this in more detail. But just to provide a foundation for this discussion, most of you already understand this, some of you know this very intimately, but it's worth putting this into a hard numerical sense. Again, for those of you who took my class last year or the year before, you'll know that I talk about, we show you graphs like this one. This comes from UNAIDS, which is a global map that talks about this particular one is the number of people, or children, adults and children living with HIV around the world. It's 35 million people. Those are numbers sprinkled on a map. But the purpose for all of us, and it's often forgotten in these kinds of discussions, it's certainly often forgotten in places like Geneva and London and Atlanta, is that numbers on a graph aren't just numbers, they're lives, and they're deaths. And they're lives and deaths that affect individuals, and families, and lovers, and communities, and nations. But when I look at this, I think of people. And when we talk about people, then we start talking about individual rights, we start talking about individual decisions and health and so on. But again, just for purposes of orienting, though, 35 million people infected with HIV, that probably means something in the neighborhood of 200 million people affected by HIV, if not more than You can't see this, but it's important to note that from the back anyways, that there are 2.5 million new cases of HIV every year around the world. 2.5 million cases around the world, and cases in every continent of the world. And every bloody one of them is preventable. 2.5 million cases of people infected with a stigmatizing, often lethal disease, and preventable. And I get pissed off about that because I get to be sometimes, unfortunately or fortunately, the person who actually administers the death sentence or the death pronouncement to those individuals. Of course, this is a panel discussion around LGBT, and of course it would be blind to not acknowledge the fact that there are populations of people who are at increased risk of acquiring HIV and increased risk of dying of its complications. Now, we don't have good statistics on the numbers of people who are gay or lesbian who have HIV outside of the North. I use that word in a pejorative kind of sense because it speaks to the reason, it asks the reason why we don't have good data from sub-Saharan Africa or Eastern Europe and Central Asia or East Asia, and that has to do with issues of stigma, discrimination, and criminalization of the disclosure of one's status in a medical environment. And so we're left in part, and again this is a bit metaphorical, but these are the US data that track the percentage of people living with HIV or who have AIDS in this particular graph, or stratified by the risk group they self-identify with. Okay? And this actually looks at the entire history of the US epidemic, which I think is a remarkable thing that we've been able to capture. So this point out here is 1985, where you can see that 65% of individuals who had AIDS self-identified as being a man who had sex with men, and so on. So despite Tom Hanks in Philadelphia, which would leave one with the image in our mind's eye, our nation's mind's eye, that all people with HIV are gay, in fact it was only 2/3, it already tells you how much we tended to stigmatize and stereotype the epidemic, even here. And one can only imagine, or doesn't need to imagine much, because he was there, how closeted and stigmatized this group or other risk groups might be in other parts of the world. So this graph actually tells us a lot of interesting things, and again, we'll talk about this in our class, but it talks about, it graphically shows the rise of self-reporting of injection drug use as a risk factor for acquiring HIV, and this remarkable trend over the last several years of the decline, really about a half of injection, or the percentage of injection drug users newly diagnosed with AIDS has been cut in half. And that has to do with issues related to harm reduction, despite all of its stigma and difficulty from a policy perspective. The other thing that's worth noting is the rise in purple of people who self-identify as being heterosexual, and the subsequent initial decline and subsequent rise in the numbers of gay men, or men who had sex with men here in the U.S. having AIDS. So public health successes and public health failures, all of which one should put into the context of what are we doing right and what are we doing wrong. And one of the things we're doing wrong is we allow 1.5 million people around the world to fucking die every year because we can't get our act together from a public policy and community motivation and mobilization perspective. So 1.2 million people die every year in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, needlessly. And that's what we're talking about today. Now, it's gotten better. And again, if you've been working in the field or you read UNAIDS reports or World Health Organization reports, you'll see that as we've scaled up antiretroviral coverage in high-impact countries, we've actually reduced the number of deaths. So, and there are estimates in the neighborhood of tens of millions of years of life saved, tens of millions of years life saved by getting therapy to people, getting people engaged in care. So that's also public health success in continental terms. It's also relevant to know that we've come a long way with prevention, at least in the clinical trials laboratory. So this graph talks about what we're doing absent having a preventive vaccine. Down below are vaccine trials that show there's about a 20 to 30% efficacy. But what we've learned, and really, these are Nobel Prize quality findings in the last 2 or 3 years, is that if you give people at risk who are HIV negative, if you give them medicines, you can reduce the risk of acquiring HIV anywhere between 50 and 80%. Imagine a world where 80% of the people at risk for getting HIV don't get it. Moreover, if you actually just give people who have HIV treatment, they don't transmit to their lovers and their drug partners. And that effectiveness is in the neighborhood of 95%. So 2.5 million new cases a year around the world. These data say that if we get off our lazy butts, we can actually prevent most of that. Okay. So it's worth knowing, though, or asking, why don't we do that? And so these are data from UNAIDS that talk, now this is specifically data that pertains to men who have sex with men. And it says, how good a job are we doing at the community level of rendering services that are helpful and preventive and life-saving to men who have sex with men. So, each of these columns represents either low, middle, upper middle, or high-income countries. How well do we do with condoms? Access to condoms, even in high-income countries, is only 45%. Are you kidding me? 30% or so in low-income countries. How about access to lubricants? So it's great, you give somebody a condom, but they got no lube. What happens to the condom? Right? It doesn't work so well, or it doesn't feel so good. So 34% of men who have sex with men in upper-income countries have access to lube, but only 8% in low-income countries. It's connecting really stupidly easy dots, but we don't do it. Access to HIV testing, 50% in high-income countries, less than a third in low and middle-income countries. And the story isn't any better with access to treatment. 50% have access to treatment in high-income countries. This is HIV treatment. And it's a stepwise fashion of countries' income and access to life-saving HIV treatment. This suggests to me that the barrier to this is money. It's not science. The other issue that is really topical, and if you're interested in public policy as a career in health, this is where you should be writing your first faculty grants or your first grants to donor organizations. It has to do with this issue of engagement in care. And I'm proud to say that these data were first sort of born here in Colorado from Denver Health and a really nice, bright faculty member who's a couple years my junior named Ed Gardner, who coined the term the cascade of care. Basically what this says is that even in the United States, with the most well-endowed healthcare system in the world, only 80% of people who have HIV know their status. That is to say 20% don't. And of the 80% who know their status, 20% again fail to actually ever walk in the door of a medical clinic, at least within the first 1 to 3 years of their diagnosis. Another 20% fail to come back after the first year. And another 20% fail to ever go on treatment. And so one should ask, why is that? And I'll at least give you my notion, which is a lot of that has to do with stigma, discrimination, and ignorance. Ignorance not in the negative pejorative sense, but I just don't know. I wasn't told. So that's here in the US, where you can say, well, these are issues wrapped up with our puritanical sense of what's right and wrong. But in fact, even in sub-Saharan Africa, if you actually manage to cross those initial barriers and get into care, here are data that ask what happens once you get on treatment, what happens over the next few months? So if you live in Uganda, for example, it means that almost 50% of people fall out of care in the first several years of treatment. Why is that? Stigma, discrimination, criminalization, and ignorance. There's no pill for that, so that leaves doctors like me really frustrated because I don't know how to solve these kinds of things, but I know how to help discover pills. So that just leaves me with a couple of closing remarks on what it means to do this and where I think we're heading, and at least an unabashed plug for IAPAC, the association that I've been very fortunate to work with over the actually, I've been working unofficially for them for the last 8 years, but officially in-house for the last 2. And so we're partners with the United Nations UN AIDS program. And so we actually got to be the place across the street from Westminster Abbey in London where we announced jointly the UN AIDS Global Report and the 2015 goals. And this guy is actually a friend of mine, I'm proud to say, whose name is Michel Sidibe, who's the executive director of the world's largest program in HIV care around the world. And by the way, he's not a physician. He's a health economist and human rights advocate, and a pretty nice guy. And I just wanted to just close with highlighting just a couple of things that come from Michel's work that talk directly to the kinds of things we want to think about today, which is it's the stated goal of UNAIDS, that is to say, a stated goal of programs around the world where UNAIDS touches to reduce sexual transmission of HIV by 50% by next year. This is not pie-in-the-sky stuff. This is next year. We're talking in the next 18 months. Okay? This is doable if we believe it can happen. A little more difficult is to try to eliminate HIV-related stigma, discrimination, punitive laws and practices. And that's Renee's work, Don's. But those are huge challenges. And the last one that also is a huge challenge, but also achievable, is to actually put 15 million people living with HIV in low and middle income countries on life-saving therapy, on therapy that prevents transmission to their lovers and their drug-using partners in 18 months. Okay, so we have a lot of work to do. I should say in closing, though, that the UN over 10 years ago said that discrimination on the basis of one's HIV status, that is also to say discrimination on the basis not just of HIV status, but the things that put one at risk for HIV. That means who they have sex with, who they share drugs with, where they work, where they play. All of those things are violations of human rights. And so this wonderful, maybe not so wonderful, personal, interesting and wonderful career that I've had has taken me from being someone working in drug discovery, working lockstep with gay scientists and gay doctors and gay community advocates, has me now working on the human rights aspect and the communications aspects and the faith aspects of what prevents people from entering into care and staying in care. And so that is the last of my PowerPoint slides. If you want, please feel free to email me. But I'll turn the podium over to my good friend, Don Esser. And Alex, I think you get this done?
Okay. I'm not going to use PowerPoint and just talk with you, but I do have a script I'm going to use. Last weekend I was with my grandson, 15-year-old Noah, and he said, "What are you doing this coming week?" And I said I was coming here to speak to this on this panel and talk about issues facing gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender persons in Africa. And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because they're being mistreated, persecuted." But then he stopped and looked at me and said, "Well, how's it going to do any good for you to go to University of Denver and talk about it? How's that going to help any people in Africa?" Which was a good question, I thought. How is this going to help anybody in Africa? Well, I thought he cut to the core. Is this just an intellectual exercise we're involved in today? A nice conversation in a safe setting with free pizza? A feel-good session of like-minded persons feeling very smug about ourselves and our liberal pronouncements? Or do we have a greater agenda or tactics for the future that will make a difference? So my immediate answer to my grandson was more in the arena of hope than in the realm of strategy. I told him that I trusted that somehow this seminar would attract the attention to persons who previously had not considered the issues that are facing humanity and Africa in particular. That it might prompt some students from this distinguished school to pursue future policies that ensure human rights for all persons, including LGBT persons. That even possibly some African students would be present who might return home and make a difference in the long run. In other words, I didn't know what the outcome of today's panel might be, but I dreamt it might make a difference sooner rather than later, I hope. Let me say my credentials to speak on the subject are rather thin. I did not pretend to be an expert on, or that my experience is extensive. However, during my last 3 visits to Kenya, I spent time with the LGBT community of Nairobi, and as you'll discover today, I was the connecting point for the conversations and for my friend Peter, whose video you're about to see. On 2 occasions, I was able, through the Center for the Church and Global AIDS that I founded, a very small charity here in the city, to sponsor a day forum on the general topic of the church and human rights of LGBT persons. This has been an opportunity in Nairobi for persons to make formal presentations on issues and challenges that the gay community in Africa face. It's also been a time for developing friendships and relationships, but most of all for me, a time for listening and learning. Last year I also spent time with gay men who are seeking to provide health care to underserved and mistreated clients. You probably saw that one slide that Dr. Young just showed about lubricants. Well, that's something that doesn't get much attention. Certainly in church communities, we don't talk about it much. Well, when I was in this clinic in an obscure part of Nairobi, the gay men said, we don't have trouble getting condoms, but we have no lubricants. So I made the first grant from the Center for the Church and Global AIDS, a small grant to buy lubricants. Wrote home and told my board of directors that we just bought some lubricants. my board here in Denver was very happy because we've got to be honest and open about these issues, and we've got to deal with issues. That's a real issue, a real big issue that's overlooked easily. Additionally, I've met some African LGBT leaders who have participated in international AIDS conferences in Vienna and Washington, D.C., as well as the conferences in Asia that I participate in. All of these experiences have been both heartbreaking and hopeful. First of all, heartbreaking because the experiences persons have shared. The widespread level of violence they face may be beyond our imagination. Peter and Paul were 2 men I met at the seminars in Kenya the first time, both of whom came at that meeting with fresh scars on their face where they're beaten by mobs. And we're going to hear Peter, I believe, in the video speak. Getting medical care is often impossible or humiliating. You don't want to go to the places things are going to get worse if you go to get medical care. Rejection by family, friends, society, and church are common stories. Denial of their existence as sacred human beings and discrimination in employment, schooling, and human rights persists. The daily struggle for survival forces many to engage in risky sex work in order to find some limited funds even to exist because they're not going to get employed anywhere else. Adding insult is the claim that their sexual orientation is a Western phenomenon, not truly African. So the people I meet with discover that the church labels them as sinners and the countrymen as unpatriotic. But also, I've seen great signs of hope. The LGBT community in Africa refuses to be silent. Their courage in speaking out for human rights and dignity is again almost beyond our imagination. Despite the stigma, suffering, discrimination, and violence, many dare to speak truth to power, to question society standards, and to challenge the church's bigoted teachings. They have formed organizations, and they are pressing for legal status. They dare to come out even though they face seemingly insurmountable persecution and mistreatment. If we were to rewrite John F. Kennedy's famous book, these African women and men would constitute today's profiles of courage. Movements of justice never sweep forward unimpeded, however. Backlash seems unavoidable. Steps forward almost always result in pressures for step backwards. Progress is never inevitable. Across the world today, in Russia, in India, in Nigeria, in Cameroon, Uganda, Utah, elsewhere, we see resistance to change. As Jeff Charlotte writes in this month's Gentleman's Quarterly, liberal Americans imagine LGBT rights as slowly but surely marching forward. But queer rights don't advance along a straight line. In Russia and throughout Eastern Europe, and in India and Australia, and a belt across Central Africa, anti-gay crusaders are developing new laws and sharpening old ones. The ideas, meanwhile, are American. The rhetoric of family values, churned out by right-wing think tanks, bizarre statistics to prove that evil is a fact. Let's face a gay one. This hatred is old venom, but its weaponization by hate nations as a means with which to fight globalization, not the economic kind, but the human rights kind, is a new kind of terror. Yes, that's the reality of today's world. However, I also think it's a great time to be alive. I wish I was your age and I had more time to deal with these issues. For around the world, we have an opportunity to identify with the movement for equal rights for all human beings. In Martin Luther King's memorable words, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And although there are political, societal, and religious barricades erected to block justice and freedom, and they seem insurmountable, I yet believe we will succeed. However, in President Barack Obama's words, it bends toward justice, but it does not bend on its own. It bends because each of us in our own ways put our hands on that arc and we bend it in the direction of justice. So each of us has to put our own hand on that arc. We have to decide how we're going to help move that arc of justice in the moral universe. In my case, I'm a theological educator, United Methodist pastor, so I work in the religion of the realm of the church. And I've determined to help end AIDS in our lifetime and to work toward human rights for all people. I regret to say that the church community in general is not supportive of either of these ends. The church has been a major force to fuel stigma and continues to be for HIV persons, and certainly has shown great stigma and discrimination against LGBT persons. So this is an uphill battle. But AIDS cannot be eradicated until the rights and dignity of all people are respected. Nothing infuriates me more than people being mistreated. What especially upsets me is the role of religion in fostering and fueling stigma and discrimination. Thus, I have discovered my calling as a Christian pastor and theologian is to address these issues. In particular, I try to challenge people to take 5 steps on an ethical and justice journey. And I'll share them briefly with you. First, and I know many of you have some relation to churches or religious communities, so I'm inviting you to working right while you're still here as students before your future times. But we've got to break the silence about sex, stigma, human rights, and struggle against AIDS. We need to talk about it in our families, in our churches, in our synagogues, in our universities, in our classrooms, our communities. People have to be able to talk about these issues without fear of recrimination, without bullying or bigotry. I'm haunted by a question that Peter asked me, and you'll see Peter in a few minutes, right after he'd been beaten by that mob. He said, why don't other Christians help us out? Why are Christians so silent about people being violated in violence today in our country and around the world? Second, let us promote anti-stigma programs in every place. For example, in the church, it's amazing to me that the church is so stigmatizing persons with HIV and AIDS. After all, the church follows Jesus, who was always engaged in healing ministries and no evidence whatsoever of any stigma. Perhaps some of those illnesses described in the Bible were sexually transmitted, we don't know. We never hear any words of stigma or discrimination. Third, let's stand in solidarity with our sisters and brothers in the LGBT community, not afraid to identify and name bigotry whenever policies deny human rights or promote stigma and discrimination. We cannot pretend that we champion the rights of all human beings or that we even promote human rights in church, academia, and society, and then show any hesitancy about supporting LGBT persons. The church and the society have tried in the past to justify discrimination against women and against African Americans based on the Bible and tradition and we still try to do that. Prejudice, however, always crumbles, and bigotry demeans us all. Fourth, we need to talk in our churches, our communities, that homophobia, not homosexuality, is a lifestyle choice. We do not choose our sexual orientation, but we do choose whether we're going to be accepting, kind, generous, caring, loving persons. Efforts to change a person's sexual orientation are harmful and futile. Fifth, let us refocus our religious attention on spiritual, not sexual orientation of our members and our leadership. Same-sex, age-appropriate, mutually consenting, loving relationships are not incompatible with Christian teaching. Instead, lives lacking the love of God, neighbor, and self are incompatible with Christian teaching. The sexual orientation of a religious person is not important, but rather a life based on honesty, integrity, fidelity, and compassion, along with the commitment from the Hebrew Scriptures to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Yes, with Martin Luther King, I believe injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. This means, for me, addressing these 5 steps in church, academia, and society. It's not enough to do this occasionally at the University of Denver. We must also be engaged in our communities, in our organizations, and churches to raise financial resources to help our brothers and sisters in Africa with their advocacy organizations, to raise money so that liberal religious groups will hold seminars and workshops that openly address these issues, encouraging reflection, education, dialogue, and policy change. What we have now is an extreme right, most conservative, spending lots of money in Africa, reinforcing the stigma and bias, and the absolute silence of the other churches, and no real counterpoint going on in most places. For persons of faith, be we Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, or whatever, life always triumphs over death, and love trumps over hate. Only you, and me, we can determine what we're willing to do or not to do. But together, I hope that we will together help bend the moral arc of the universe away from condemnation to compassion, stigmatization to liberation, fear to faith, and apathy to action. Thank you.
Actually, it's fitting that I'm sort of between you guys because the things I'm going to talk about are sort of between both of these. I'm going to start 10 years ago when I was Fulbright in Zambia. I went there to study communication about HIV and AIDS, and I spent a year. I was mostly upcountry, mostly in rural areas, living in villages, living with families, and doing a lot of work to really just sort of understand what people thought about HIV and AIDS, what people said about HIV and AIDS, what was happening. And in that respect, I will say we have come a long way in the past decade. At that time, nobody was talking about it, and to talk about it was very much stigmatized, even talking about it, let alone having the disease or recognizing that the disease existed. Even though there were people dying everywhere, literally everywhere. At one point I was associated with a university and I taught a class there. And they had these buses at this university. Every day you would see a bus full of people going in and out and in and out. I kept asking about these buses and nobody wanted to talk about it. And finally, once I built up some friendships there and relationships there, people started to tell me that those are the funeral buses. And those are funeral buses for people dying every day at the university of HIV and AIDS. And of course, nobody even wanted to say that that's what it was. There was a university professor at the university where I was whose son died from AIDS. And he felt that he was very fortunate enough to be able to pay someone to write in his death certificate that he died from malaria, because he did not want to bring shame to his family that the death certificate would say that he died of AIDS. So this is, the stigma was unbelievable there. So as you can imagine, nobody was talking about this as an LGBT issue at that point. I think that just as much we were in denial here in this country about this being a gay disease, they were in denial there about this being a heterosexual disease. And I think that even still today, that is something that continues with the stigma, with this disease, in the places that I have worked in Africa, mostly sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Africa. And so at that particular point, getting people to talk about this was, as I said, hard enough. And so there was nothing, I was amazed, there was absolutely nothing around men having sex with men and that being part of the conversation. It was simply about, the big struggle was to get, the antiretrovirals were not there, so the medication was not there, people were not getting tested, people were not getting treated, and so there was a huge stepping stone to even get a recognition of what was going on and why so many people were dying. One of the things that I was interested to see was that I started getting connected to some of the very large mining companies, and which are some of the biggest businesses in Zambia is a big copper country, and copper mines that are owned by South Africans and owned by Brits and Canadians, and there's an American owned mine there as well. And those mining companies asked me if I would come help them to do workshops on education, to educate their workers about HIV and AIDS, which was very exciting to hear that they wanted to do this. They wanted to open up this conversation. But the good and bad part about this was that the reason why they wanted to do this is because they were losing so much of their workforce. So much of their workforce was dying, and they cost them a lot of money to train people, and so retraining people because they were losing their workforce meant that it was much more economical for them to try to educate their workers and to try to do what they could to decrease the rate at which people were dying. And so one of these companies even went so far as to purchase antiretrovirals and make them available for free in their clinic at the mine. And one of the things that they were confused about was like, why couldn't they get anybody to come and get these drugs? And I'll let you guys guess yourselves, but of course nobody was going to self-identify as having this. They didn't want to admit it themselves, let alone did they want to come to the company where they work and admit that they had this disease. And so they had all this free medication, which they had to figure out how they could convince their workers to take. So that was 10 years ago, and luckily we've come a long way since then. But as Dr. Young has suggested, we still have a very, very long way to go with this. And I will say that fast forward to now in terms of the connections with the LGBT issue. There are some connections that are being made. We don't know the numbers of people who are gay who have HIV and AIDS. It's still stigmatized enough that that's not something that's happening there. But people are starting to talk about men having sex with men, and of that part of it being a part of what's happening. And what's also interesting is, and this actually connects back to Don, is we were connected to the pastor that Alex mentioned, and he is a strong advocate for gays and lesbians and trying to bring them into his church. He told us that he can't tell people that that their church is friendly to LGBT people, but that it's just by word of mouth, because if they were to tell people that would stigmatize the church, they had to move from one place where they were giving services to another place because word got out. So it's very much kept quiet in terms of that, but he's been doing quite a lot to embrace the community and to invite them into his church. Peter is one of the people who goes to that church. And he actually, while we were there, was working on a speech he was going to go give to a convention in Tanzania, a convention of pastors, to talk about why he felt that the church needed to start embracing LGBT people and also people with HIV and AIDS. And he really felt that those were very, very connected. And he felt that it was a great way to get people to be more accepting of LGBT people because he saw his parishioners as starting to be more accepting of people with HIV. And he felt like that was the time and the place to bring in this acceptance of people with HIV to widen that net to be an acceptance of LGBT people. And it was really wonderful to see what he wanted to do and what he was going to try to to say to this group of pastors in Tanzania. And he knew that there would be some who would be accepting of what he had to say, but he also knew that he would be up against a lot of people who would vehemently disagree with him. And he's doing a lot for the community there. There are a lot of people in Kenya. Kenya is one of 38, I believe, countries in Africa where it is criminalized, LGBT is criminalized through various sodomy laws and other ways in which these laws are written, most of which actually came from colonialism, which I think Alex is going to talk a little bit about. So these actually, are laws that we brought with us over to the continent. And some people would argue that we are still trying to enforce those laws through a lot of the missionary groups that are there and the evangelicals in terms of these laws. So Kenya is one of the places where it is criminalized, but there hasn't been a prosecution in a long time. And so Kenyans will tell you that Kenya is a place that is better off than places like Uganda and Senegal and other places. But of course they still get harassed all the time. There's a lot of harassment that gets reported. In July, when we were there this past summer, there was a report that came out that was issued that was simply trying to recognize the number of gays and lesbians in Kenya, and one of the things that the report said was that the highest concentration of gays and lesbians in Kenya were in Mombasa and Nairobi and Kisumu. Well, there was a huge backlash after that happened, and several people were attacked. People went onto the streets and attacked. In Mombasa, there was a man who was killed with a machete for looking gay. That was a backlash that happened where people wanted to say, we don't have gays in Kenya. And so there's this sort of up and down ebb and flow in terms of the way that things go. One of the things that Alex and I have actually been working on is an analysis of the news articles because we're interested in the connection with the West. And the connection with things like these reports that come out, things like when we were there, President Obama, he didn't come to Kenya, which people were very upset about, but he did come to the continent, and he did say that he felt like that Africans needed to be more accepting of gays and lesbians, and people were very, very upset by that. They felt that was the West telling them what to do and trying to put Western values, on Kenyans, and that was not right. And so we are interested in the extent to which some of this backlash is as we move forward, and just as Don was saying, it's not this linear path of progression of rights, but in some ways there does seem to be a connection between as we move forward and some of the progression that we make is their backlash in other parts of the world as a result of that. And some of it in terms of, again, this, who are you to tell us what to do? And certainly we've seen that in Uganda with the law that they passed. I mean, I think people were able to convince them not to make it the death penalty for being gay and lesbian there, but certainly the imprisonment, life imprisonment, and what they have done is I guess a little better, but still, really awful. And so, again, there are people who are trying to make those connections in terms of what it is that we do here in the West and the broader influence that has around the world in terms of what happens there. So one of the things also that the pastor has mentioned, and that some of that we worked on, was how they can have within their community, so they have parishioners at their parish, and he wants to, again, this connection between LGBT and HIV and AIDS. He does HIV and AIDS education with his parishioners, and again, he has found that they're pretty accepting of that, and he has been having some of the, Peter and others, actually do some of that work, and then he finds that people are really open to the education that they're doing, and then they find out after they get to know people, after they get to know their fellow parishioners, and then after a while they find out that they are gay or lesbian or transgendered, and that they're much more accepting because now it's somebody that they know, and now it's connected to, the these other areas. And so it's another thing we talked about was them doing more in the realm of health education and becoming community health workers in their communities, and doing community health work or in the communities. And then again, this idea that they're focusing on the health work, they're focusing on health promotion, but then eventually, because the community health workers build relationships with families and build a relationship with people, eventually they get to know them and they get to be more comfortable with this, and then they can possibly find out and let them know. Peter, for example, is someone who is an activist, who is willing to let people know that he is gay, to do that and sort of work in that way to have people be more accepting. And I think it's just great to see way that those that's happening sort of on the ground, this grassroots. The last thing I'm going to say is that another thing that we noticed when we were there is, and I think that something that's really important is, and part of this talk was, one of the things that Alex and I reacted to was, I'm a lesbian. It's pretty obvious that I'm a lesbian, but it's pretty privileged for me to be there. I can be in Kenya, and I can be an out lesbian, and it's a privilege. Nobody's going to bother me, really. And that's not necessarily the case for average people in places like Kenya. And I think that that's really important to recognize, and we saw that even with Kenyans, and so I think it's pretty obvious as far as being Westerners, but we saw that with Kenyans, that there are, just as Dr. Young's slides were representing the wealth and the wealth divide in terms of access to services. It's a very similar thing as far as access to privilege around being LGBT there as well. And I think that's another thing that's really important to recognize in this, is that there's a lot of people who are the activists there who we saw, and that those who are upper class have a much better shot at being able to be the voice of raising issues around LGBT, and and people who are from the working classes and lower classes have a much more difficult time with that. Lots more to say, but we're running out of time, so.
Press forward.
There we go. You guys think that everybody can hear me if I still sit down? Is that good? You guys can, you guys can't see my face, but that's fine. So we were actually debating whether or not to tack this additional component onto the end of it, but I think that the panelists each touched upon some of these topics a little bit in each of their presentations, and we're going to go ahead and save Peter's interview for last now. So we wanted to talk a little bit about the illegality of LGBT citizens throughout the world. So Erica Mbembe's murder, it received massive international attention, and that is actually why Randall Kuhn reached out to us to do this, because it was, like I said, it was an assault on a movement, and we wanted to draw more attention to it, but we didn't exactly know what our role would be. So Dr. Mesa really touched upon this. We can sit around here and we can talk about our opinions about things that are going on the other side of the world from the safety of the United States all we want, but is it really going to make a difference? And what exactly are we talking about? Do we even know what it's like to be an LGBT person on the ground? Hopefully that is something that Peter can clue us into a little bit in his interview. But more importantly, it's really easy for us to sit down here and look at these maps and just label Africa as homophobic. And just sit there and sit back, and we can just judge them for their homophobia, or we can mock it with cute little cartoons like this, or we can pity them, or we can stand behind a podium and we can condemn them for their supposed homophobic prohibitions. And I'm not saying a prohibition on same-sex marriage is not homophobic, but John Kerry's standing there behind the podium And declaring it homophobic without looking at where these laws actually come from may be more problematic than anything else. So before we, and by we I mean like students in international affairs, future international professionals, and people in the West who are looking to do a little bit of good in the world, I hope, I think that we need to sit back and kind of take a closer look at where some of these laws come from. So we can start here. It's important to realize that many of these anti-gay laws, the ones that are used to criminalize same-sex love, to outlaw LGBT identities, and they're used to incite violence against queer people like we've talked about, most of these laws are directly linked to Western influences, both colonial and present day. And these are coming more from these Western influences than they're coming from any specific African culture. So as much as we want to label them homophobic, we really need to take a look and examine our role in all of this. So in other words, I think that we can blame England. Not that I actually have anything against UK, but there is a very direct link between colonialism and these anti-gay laws that are still on the books in all of these African nations. And when we get into like the importing of homophobia, how Africa got into that habit of importing homophobia, we need to look at how we got into the habit of exporting this kind of hatred. So I'm going to take this a little historical approach to this. By the way, this is also my thesis title. So I'm going to take a look at a historical approach. I know history is extremely boring, so I'm going to make this as quick as possible. So first we're going to go back in time. Once upon a time, before he was the prime minister, we had a guy named King Henry VIII. And he was made famous for splitting England with the church, but also for his many, many wives. And this pillar of moral rectitude decided he wanted to legislate against what everybody else was doing in their bedrooms. So he came up with the Buggery Act of 1533, and that is actually the fancy name that it was published under officially in the law books. So this law in 1533 actually punished homosexuality and homosexual acts with life in prison and all the way up to the death penalty. And it wasn't until 1967 that this was repealed. But then again, in 1988, the Iron Lady, she came through and decided to push through Section 28, which prohibited the promotion of homosexuality, which is strikingly similar to Russia's new anti-gay propaganda law. And that wasn't until 2003 that was then overturned again. So the decriminalization of gay people in England did not happen until 2003, when I think all of us were alive. And that was 500 years. But the damage was already done. Unfortunately, at the same time, most European powers were on a quest to take over the entire world, and they spread all of their legislature and all of their legal systems throughout all of their colonies. So with that, with all of the prohibitions against same-sex acts that came with the Buggery Act, they were codified with the Buggery Act, they were also enshrined in all the legal systems throughout most of these countries. And you can still see all of these anti-gay legislatures, there's remnants of them all over the world, all the way from India to Southeast Asia, through the Caribbean and the Middle East. And I think the Middle East is probably one of the most interesting ones to look at, because the West is very quick to blame Islam for their less progressive laws towards homosexuality. But in reality, most of them come from Section 377, I believe, of the Anti-Buggery Act. But because of the topic of the panel, we're going to focus a little bit more on Africa, of course. So of the 55 states in Africa, 38 of them still criminalize same-sex acts. 18 of them were former British colonies. I did not memorize all of them. It's Burundi, Sudan, Lesotho, Botswana, Kenya, Somalia, Ghana, Nigeria, Zambia, Gambia, Malawi, Sierra Leone, Swaziland, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Uganda, Tanzania, and Cameroon. So there's a varying extent to which these laws are actually enforced, and Renee touched on that a little bit. Even if they haven't made an arrest, like in Kenya, in years, the people that are identified as LGBT in these communities are still open to harassment. Basically what happens is if your identity is criminalized, you're not just a second-class citizen, you're actually an outlaw in your own country. And that avails you to a myriad of human rights abuses, including harassment, blackmail, assault, murder, and most of the times when you're assaulted like this, the people that are perpetrating this against you are doing it with impunity. There's no way that you're going to go to the cops after being assaulted in the streets because you're gay and tell them that it was because you're gay, because then you're just going to be the one gets arrested. So it's important to note that the mere existence of these laws, whether or not they're enforced, whether or not people are actually actively going to jail for them, is really important to note. But there are two countries in here, Uganda and Nigeria, that are actively trying to harshen some of these laws. And you'll see that coming up in the papers all the time. John Kerry's making statements about it every other day. And yeah, and these laws are actually effectively going to harshen these punishments, put the death penalty up for gays, and again, also for anybody that knows of any homosexual living around them and doesn't report them. So these have been met with varying resistance from the Parliament, or they've been pushed forward. And this is actually going to bring us to the modern players in the neo-colonial attempt to export homophobia to Africa. So you guys may know this group, the Westboro Church. So this is Fred Phelps' group that has decided they're anti-gay, along with anti-soldier, anti-Obama, pro-9/11, anti-sports, I think, anti-kitten, they're anti-everything. And so because of these ridiculous inflammatory things that they've been doing, they've lost almost all of their credibility in the States. So what they've decided to do is then export all of their ideas and everything and take all of their ridiculous amounts of resources and take that to Africa. So they've set up churches and offices all throughout the region. And what they're doing on the ground is mobilizing people, offering them the key to heaven if they are to extol all of these homophobic views that they were pretty much kicked out of the United States for. And they're also the ones that are key to lobbying for these restrictive policies against same-sex acts, and they're also the ones that are funding homophobic politicians with all of their resources. Any and all homophobic politicians that they can find, they're putting them in office and then pushing this legislature through them. So this is one of these guys. This is Scott Lively, who's the head of one of these ministries that's over there right now. There's an active suit in the United States against him right now for doing this. And the irony of it all is that he's been telling people in Uganda and in Nigeria, which he takes full credit for extolling these anti-homosexuality things, that